Our guest of honor for today's Salon is Kowalchuk, whom many of you will remember from his October 2015 presentation, Collecting, Making a Museum of One's Own. Paul is an avid collector of mid-20th century American studio pottery. He is also an exhibition curator, author, and founder of the online ceramics collectors blog, Studio Potter Archive. Paul is also a co-founder and creative director of TVA Studios, an animation short film production company. Without further ado, please welcome Paul.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you all for being here. It's great to be back here. Each and every time I walk here into Diane's flat, it's like stepping back into my own home, and especially being surrounded by Louis's work is even it's great. It's just a wonderful feeling to be here. So I thank you all for stepping out today for this series. I would like to start by saying that the presentation that I'm going to give is going to be part academic and part freestyle. The freestyle aspect will be talking about the pottery, but the academic part will be selections of passages in previous research, but also new writings that I've created for you to fully understand Louis's career, his work ethic, his techniques, and where I could, and as much as possible, I've included his voice in terms of direct quotes, so you can actually hear the man as he spoke in a number of recordings that I did with him in 2012 as part of a process for Studio Potter Archive to document his career and his life in the arts. And so let me begin. A legacy begins with work. One key point that is crucial in understanding the legacy that is Louis Mendez is knowing of the incredible work ethic he possessed. Louis was born in 1929 in Spanish Harlem, New York City, and spent his formative childhood and teenage years in Goshen, New York. While working on the family farm, Louis developed an understanding of what he says was the result of long days at doing chores. It was discipline in one's work, a strong character trait, and one that served him well over his lifetime. Back during his days as a student at New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred, he received a BFA in 1952 and an MFA in 1954. Louis once remarked to me that his insatiable need to throw on the wheel often had him sneaking into the supply closet to replenish the clay he had used up. And further remarking, there just didn't seem to be enough. And although we laughed, from where I sat, I couldn't help but notice that the handwriting, written early on in his career, had already been put to the wall. Louis also told me that on a given day, in his own studio in Goshen, New York, he would produce a gross of mugs. That's 144 by sundown, and sometimes for a few consecutive days when needed. This early period of work of the mid-1950s to early 1960s, as Louis pointed out, was driven into New York City and sold out of the trunk of my car. As it is, these pilgrimages into the Big Apple were in part quintessential to the success of a small upstart company called Pottery Barn. Greater success soon followed, and much to buyers' satisfaction, Louis took to supplying retailers Georg Jensen, America House, Pottery of All Nations, and Holland House with his wares. Louis Mendez had the wherewithal to produce in quantity, whether this is in mugs or his highly successful line of masks made during the 1980s. Where there was demand, there was Louis ready to fulfill that demand. And to a whole generation of potters, the fact that Louis was an output powerhouse was no secret. And the work speaks for itself. And in the instance that one can speak for it, the explanations as to why Mendez created the things he has would be enough to fill a book. For Louis, there's numbers of mediums, and within those mediums, there's a number of paths to take when strolling through such a large body of work. With the pieces I've brought with me today, I can provide a narrative as to some of these paths. In addition, the abundance of work here in Diane's home will allow us to travel down some others. The early work. Louis's beginnings in pottery was primarily found in classical forms. Ones he found illustrated throughout countless library books, then represented with great skill during his college years. They are artistically satisfying, in part because of their directness and matter-of-fact objectivity, which keeps them fresh and invigorating. The 50s works, with their openness and expressiveness, show the same modernist sensibility that gave rise to a good design era in craft. A mid-20th century ideal, once captured by MoMA exhibitions that bore the same name. Louis's work from the 1950s and 1960s is a benchmark today for potters and is found within many advanced collections of American ceramics, including private and public institutions. Examples of this work, one piece which I've just recently acquired, perhaps last year, is this person pot. It's a people pot, and it was done in 1953. And at Louis's time at Alfred University, in his graduate program, he went to work for a company called Bennington Potters. If anyone is familiar with that company, Bennington Potters was quintessentially a kind of a powerhouse in American studio production craft that outfitted tables, the American tables, dinner tables during the 1950s. Louis was Bennington Potter's first designer. And at that time, he created this piece. It's signed actually with his name, Louis Mendez, and it's his formal name, L-U-I-S, not L-O-U-I-S. And it's also written on the bottom, Bennington. From a archivist point of view, this is highly important. Not so much because it has this information and it ties the time period for which Louis made this piece, but it's also whose hands this wound up into. After working at Bennington Potters, Louis went back to Alfred to finish up his MFA. A teacher there, Charles Harder, who is considered an American giant in the ceramics world, said, "Hey, well, what are you going to do next?" And then Louis said, "Well, I don't know." And he said, "Well, you're going to work at Lenox China in Trenton, New Jersey." So Harder made a phone call, and Louis was off to New Jersey. While at New Jersey, he met another designer, 10 years older than he, whose name is Winslow Anderson. And for people that know mid-century design or craft, Winslow Anderson was one of the geniuses behind Blanco Glass, a manufacturing company that employed many top designers, and as an American company revolutionized the idea of what blown glass was. Pieces could be small or they could be gigantic, tall bottles with stoppers. Winslow worked there, and as Louis and Winslow worked at the same time, this piece turned out into the hands of Anderson. And up until recently at his estate sale auction, this piece turned up, and I was just, to say the least, I was thrilled that it surfaced, because it not only offered, perhaps as Louis's sister Vicky said, probably one of the first people pots that he did, but it also documents the relationships. I'm sorry?
It is one of the first.
It is one of the first, yes. It also documents the relationship of just these designers at the time who were just young students, just doing their thing and getting on and getting a job and working here, many of whom turned out to be titans within the world of American craft. Looking also at that time period at Bennington, Louis went, while working there, stepped in. It was a cold winter in the fall and basically the fall out into spring of 53 to 54. It was the only time that Lewis worked at Bennington because simply he just could not stand the cold. But while he was there, he designed for David Gill, the founder of Bennington Potters, a whole new line of wares. Bennington Potters was mainly and primarily built on creating pottery from molds. And Lewis jumped right in and mastered the process of mold making at that same time. These birds are from that period. They would date to 1953 also, and as I can ascertain, were only made during that period of his tenure there at Bennington. They're extremely scarce. If you have one, good for you. It took me 10 years to find 3, and these 3 are the primary shapes. There's another one here and, well, a smaller one there, or another piece there. And here's another actual little bottle too. What's great about this set here is that Lewis had the wherewithal to photograph these pieces back in the day. So there's a corresponding picture of these 3 birds lined up and then also with this piece, which is really quite nice. Again, from an archivist's point of view. The rest of other works done at that time period were primarily utilitarian wares. Small bowls, this little fish bowl here is probably from 1955, 56. The same with this piece here, another bowl. And essentially, after the talk, if you come over, this first line is primarily 1950s works. It was a formative time for Lewis in that he went from a more traditional potter and started to, under the direction of Daniel Rhodes, who was another titan at Alfred University. It was through Rhodes that Mendez realized that he had this opportunity to not just throw a bowl or a vase or anything that was on the utilitarian side, but also to expand the possibilities of what clay can offer. Lewis's Spanish hand building technique. And as I'm talking about this section here, I'm talking about this piece here. It's called Totem Warrior, and this is the quintessential, this is the best example of his work for what it is I'm about to read to you. When artists speak of monoliths, they speak of properties that Mendez also gave to his most profound works in clay. One knows monoliths to be solid, as many of Mendez's works tell us. This is certainly the impression made by their look and feel. In Lewis's own words, I once took a trip to Spain where I observed women potters making pieces by hand. They would grab a mound of clay and flatten it with the intention of building hollow forms. This gave them much liberty to create larger forms, and upon returning, I introduced this technique to my students. I can't remember the sequence to this, but there was a show, a competition, and I entered 3 pieces using a variation of that technique. I would make an individual slab, then rip off a piece, then overlap the rough edges, one on top of another. These early works had no internal armature, and with the strongest portion of the shape being that of a sphere, I faced obvious limitations. In terms of this piece, as an example, is a piece called mitosis, which we placed here up on this. This is an example of that technique. Although it's a little later from this period, it still exhibits that sphere-type quality, which otherwise would have had no internal armature. Going back to what I said, there was a show. I believe it was at Michigan Institution, and I forget which it was. Anyway, in this case, I made these big sheets of clay, like a giant pancake, and I would start out by making these original base and crimping up the edges so that I could start building up the piece. I would have some vague idea of where I was going, but would watch it evolve as I continued to climb. And the clay, it was not hard, it was not soft, just the perfect consistency so that when you pressed it or tapped it, it would stay together. Onward, random shapes and configurations would be attached and supported by an internal clay armature, wall to wall, that offered support. The first pieces did not have the stamp design, and the fingerprints and the overlap was the one only texturing that took place on the early work. As I started progressing, I began putting in the stamps. The first stamps were quarter-sized and had linear marks, much like a Mondrian, and made of wood. Diane has placed out here a number of tiles and also styrofoam and also brick stamps for you to examine. Well, when the pieces got big, that is essentially really big, they had a good tendency to bulge or buckle in the kiln under peak temperatures. The idea was to have the piece stay uniform instead of being rectilinear. I started making smaller pieces that were partly open. So you look at it, and instead of it being mechanical, I was kind of going with these flowing movements, using pieces that would make a pattern, not necessarily brick on brick layering, like a musical composition, and always with the thought in mind that the inside was purely functional. Quickly, it became an open versus closed dynamic. The visual became an important part of it, and the idea matured. I pretty much created a literal cross-section of my creative thinking through this technique, which to me is profound based on, that's literally his process. You're able to see from start with no armature, no Spanish building technique, and developing it into a beautiful object like this. It's pretty remarkable. Next, I'd like to talk about Louis, going from, traveling from his mid-century, well, what we would refer to as mid-century modernist roots in the 1950s and 60s, into a time where he infused culture into his work. It's Louis's, it's Louis's chapter in postmodernism. Tate Museum's definition of postmodernism. And this is just one portion of a definition of postmodernism, in that it's faceted into so many different ways by which people interpret so many different variables. But this was part of their definition that absolutely fit to Louis's work. Postmodern art drew on philosophy of the mid to late 20th century and advocated that individual experience and interpretation of our experience was more concrete than abstract principles. While the modernists championed clarity and simplicity, postmodernism embraced complex layers of meaning, often mixing different artistic and popular styles and media. Postmodernist art can also consciously and self-consciously borrow from our ironically comment on a range of styles from the past. Louis was very much an expert at building relationships between the viewer and his work. Every style had its own way of catching someone's eye and establishing a connection. Take his earthenware masks, or the figures he called robots. A name he said was a misnomer, since they are really figures of an indigenous body type he saw in Guatemala while visiting with Diane in 1976. Just excuse me, I'm just going to grab these. And that would be this baby right here. This is one of his little robots. I guess the light is really quite great there. They were made in a number of sizes, anywhere from this on up to about 30 inches tall. Diane has a few of them floating around too. And as you can see here with even this shape, and considering the physical body of indigenous, someone from Guatemala, their bodies are short and stout. So let me go back to here.
And they also wear wonderful, wonderful, heavily embroidered jackets, so that, you know, it's like a color pattern. And like the hats in Peru and other places, you can identify a person's village, ethnicity, well, not ethnicity, but certainly the family line, whatever, from the decoration on the clothing. So this is sort of what came out about 6 months after that trip.
Mm-hmm. And on that point, like his earthenware masks, they are elaborately painted, saturated with kaleidoscopic colors, and you see at once how their distinctively divisible parts fit together to make an attractive whole. They also have appendages on both sides, and their quilt-like patterns are matched in complexity by sweeping patterns and expressive faces. Whether a robot stands a foot tall or a yard tall, or whether a mask is 10 to 28 inches wide, or whether a mask is 10 to 28 inches wide, all tell stories of the human complexity that lies beneath them, and often in them. One can almost see a human mystique, a person hiding behind or inside each mask and figure. And that's actually true, because if you look at some of these masks, it really looks like they have souls. These strong cultural influences captured in the work came from Mendez's passion for learning, by immersing himself, mainly through travel, into the cultures of Central and South America. Touring Guatemala and Honduras heightened Mendez's awareness of the indigenous population in rural areas. Communities of people dressed in traditional costumes going back for a millennia. Even here, their garments, as Mendez says, were beautiful artworks unto themselves. Fabrics were created and were enriched with life. Artistically, they were inspirational and beautiful. Seeing the printed patterns left a strong impression. Besides the colors and the fabrics, it was also the shape of the people themselves. Lewis elaborates, the robots started out on a fairly small scale, and I was just taken with them. Beyond that, people liked them. As things progressed, they became bigger, elongated, and more intricate. He suggested, though, that he'd taken the robot idea pretty far. This cultural imprint and subsequent artistic interpretation brought Mendez's career to new heights. Mendez began making the robots in the mid to late 70s, the more modern, larger works originating in the early 1990s. They were celebrated in many publications, galleries, and exhibitions. And Mr. Mendez's gift for reinterpreting historical styles with a modernist sensibility has yielded a comprehensive body of sculpture that secures his place in American postmodern art. They're convincing. Within postmodernism, there are many people who've exploited technique or their visual or some idea that basically exploits something on a more trivial matter. These brought in cultural references. In terms of surveying Lewis's career, I can't imagine in the future decades, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, of a museum not having one. Legacies. Earlier, I made the statement that a legacy begins with work, by which all means is true. But what's indisputable about one's ability to attain such heights is that such achievements are seldom done alone. Teamwork is often a serious facet to creating one's legacy. And when I say teamwork, I'm talking about Diane Mendez. Yes, she's certainly amazing at memory recall, especially on pinpointing dates. In fact, back when I conducted numerous interviews with Lewis, I'd ask him for a date on something, and we'd both pause, only to quickly realize that we needed an assist to make the goal. Our heads then swung around to see if Diane was in the room. But with the greatest of all intention for the use of the word, the true teamwork here is between Lewis and Diane. Lewis himself told me of the impeccable smarts Diane possesses, and the greatest ideas and insights she's brought to the table while strolling along their journey together as artists and business owners. And I've discovered the evidence. Having been through the archive, I've learned about the Senechia Cultural Center they founded back in the early 1970s, and have read a slew of newspaper clippings for exhibits and events held at their highly successful Potpourri Gallery, opened in Florida, New York in 1968, back when they were a newlywed couple. These are just two instances of the type of teamwork Lewis spoke of when talking about his Diane. And take my word, it's not saying enough when staking claim to the fact that great things happen when these two put their minds to it. Even today, as I stand here discussing the artistic legacy of a man for whom has touched so many lives, I am doing so at the graces of Diane. Mendez SoHo Salon series exemplifies Diane Mendez at her best, again. And it's not so much that she continues to dedicate her time and efforts in producing these events, but rather that her desire and determination is exerted solely to provide a platform for artists to celebrate their creative achievements. Said Vicky Alfiero, Diane was the strength behind my brother's work. Her thoughtfulness and love was the steadying influence. This celebration of Lewis's art is also a celebration of Diane Mendez. Each is no less remarkable, in exercising the union they both share together as artists and as visionaries dedicated to creating a community in which artists' potential can be explored. Thank you.